He raised his glass and smiled, the crystal catching the light of the expensive chandeliers. "May she finally have a stable family," Dylan Rhymes said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily kindness. Something her sister could never give her. A few people in the ballroom chuckled, while others looked at me with pity. I sat at the far end of the long table, the charity case in a dress that cost 3 months of my rent. To everyone else, Dylan was the hero who had stepped in when my world fell apart. He was the billionaire who had looked after the daughter of his dear, late partner. But as the wine flowed like blood and the guests clapped, I felt a familiar coldness settling in my chest. The man humiliating me in front of the city's elite was about to find out what it cost to bury the truth. He thought I was a broken girl, a junior analyst lucky to have a seat at his table. He didn't know that for 20 years I had been calculating the stress points of his empire. He didn't know that I had been waiting for this exact moment of his greatest pride to pull the final support beam. The foundations of his life were built on hollow ground, and I was the only one who knew how to make it all come crashing down. My name is Isla Thorne, and I am 28 years old. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by the scent of expensive lilies and aged scotch, I looked like a woman who had lost. My blonde hair was pulled back into a tight, professional knot, and I kept my expression neutral, even as Dylan's insults landed like physical blows. He loved to remind people that my father, his former partner, had collapsed under pressure. It was his favorite way to explain away the tragedy that had defined my life. He played the part of the grieving friend so well that even I had almost believed him when I was a child. But I wasn't a child anymore. I was a structural forensic specialist. My job was to look at ruins and figure out exactly why they fell. For the last 5 years, I had worked inside Dylan's own firm, hiding in plain sight as a quiet, hard-working analyst. I watched him make the same mistakes, over and over, driven by a greed that blinded him to the laws of physics and morality. Every time he spoke my name, he thought he was showing his power over me. He didn't realize that every interaction was just more data for my report. I wasn't just surviving, I was documenting his downfall. I was only 8 years old when the world turned black. I still remember the smell of damp earth and the deafening sound of the emergency sirens echoing through the valley. My father and mother were at the Blackwood Mine that night, celebrating a successful week of production. Dylan Rhymes was supposed to be there too, but he had called out at the last minute, claiming he had a bad feeling. Then, the ground shook. It wasn't a small tremor, it was a total structural failure. The mine didn't just cave in, it imploded. My parents were buried under thousands of tons of rock while I waited in the car, watching the dust rise like a ghost into the night sky. In the aftermath, Dylan was everywhere. He held my hand at the funeral. He told the reporters that it was an unforeseeable seismic event, a freak accident of nature that no one could have predicted. He took over my father's shares of the company to protect the legacy, and he set up a modest trust fund for my education. Everyone called him a saint. They didn't see the way he looked at the site after the cameras were gone, not with sadness, but with the cold, hard satisfaction of a man who had just cleared a path for himself. For 2 decades, the official report on the Blackwood Mine collapse sat in a locked drawer in the city archives, labeled as a natural disaster. But I knew better. I spent my nights studying geology, engineering, and the specific composition of the soil in that valley. 3 months ago, I finally found what I needed. While digging through old digital backups at the firm, I discovered the original soil density reports from the week of the collapse. They were terrifying. My father had written dozens of memos, warning that the ground was unstable and that the support beams needed to be tripled in strength. The reports showed that Dylan had personally overridden those orders. He hadn't just ignored the danger, he had actively ordered the removal of existing supports to save $4 million in steel costs. He had turned the mine into a death trap just to pad his profit margins. As I read those files, my hands shook. It wasn't an accident. It was corporate execution. My parents hadn't died because of nature. They had died because Dylan Rhymes decided that their lives were worth less than his quarterly bonus. I saved the files to an encrypted drive, knowing that the paper trail was the only weapon I had that he couldn't buy his way out of. The most sickening part of my discovery was that Dylan hadn't learned a single thing in 20 years. He was currently preparing to break ground on the Halo, a massive luxury high-rise in the heart of the city. It was going to be the crowning jewel of his career, a glass and steel monument to his ego. But as I analyzed the blueprints and the geological surveys for the new site, I felt a chilling sense of déjà vu. The Halo was being built on the same geological fault line as the Blackwood Mine. The soil was just treacherous, and the foundation plans were dangerously thin. Dylan was cutting the exact same corners again. He was using cheaper materials and bribing inspectors to sign off on a structure that would be a literal tomb for the thousands of people who would eventually live and work there. He was so confident in his untouchable status that he didn't even bother to hide the patterns. He thought he was a god who could dictate terms to the earth itself. I realized then that my mission wasn't just about the past. It wasn't just about my parents. If I didn't stop him, history was going to repeat itself on a much larger scale, and the blood would be on my hands too. The only person in Dylan's life who seemed to have a soul was his son, Raymond. Raymond and I had been childhood friends, playing in the dirt while our fathers talked business. He was kind, gentle, and completely oblivious to the monster his father truly was. He had grown up in the shadow of Dylan's success, believing every lie he was told. Now, Raymond was 30 and about to marry a woman named Beatrice. Their wedding was scheduled for tomorrow, and Dylan was planning to use the massive media coverage of the event as a PR shield to announce the groundbreaking of the Halo. It was a brilliant, disgusting move. By linking the new project to his son's wedding, Dylan was making it impossible for the press to ask hard questions about the safety of the building. Who would want to talk about soil density and structural integrity during the wedding of the century? Raymond truly loved Beatrice, and he was so happy that his father was finally proud of him. Seeing the way Dylan used his own son as a marketing tool made my stomach turn. I knew that by taking Dylan down, I would be destroying Raymond's world, but I also knew I couldn't let him build his future on a foundation of lies. I tried to do the right thing first. I took the data to a senior partner at the firm, a man named Mr. Henderson who had known my father. I thought he would be horrified. I thought he would help me. But within an hour of our meeting, I was cornered in the dimly lit parking garage by two of Dylan's private security guards. Then the black limo rolled up. The window slid down, and Dylan's face appeared, illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a teacher dealing with a troublesome student. "Drop it, Isla," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your father died a failure because he couldn't see the big picture. Don't die a nuisance. You think these numbers matter? I own the numbers. I own the people who read them." He informed me that I was fired immediately and that he had already sent out emails to every firm in the country, ensuring I would never work as an analyst again. He thought that by taking away my livelihood, he was taking away my power. He didn't realize he had just given me the one thing I needed most. Nothing left to lose. I sat in my small apartment that night, watching the clock on the wall. The wedding was in 18 hours. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Halo would happen immediately after the reception. I had tried the internal route and failed. I thought about going to the police, but Dylan had spent years donating to the Police Athletic League and the mayor's re-election campaign. He owned the local precinct. If I walked in there with my drive, the evidence would disappear before I even left the building. I needed a bigger stage and a more impartial judge. I realized the only people Dylan couldn't buy were the global insurance underwriters. They didn't care about his reputation or his donations. They only cared about the billions of dollars they would have to pay out if the Halo collapsed. If I could prove to them that he was a liability, they would pull the insurance bond and the project would be dead in its tracks. But to convince them, I needed more than just old reports. I needed the wet ink ledgers. The private, handwritten books where Dylan kept track of the actual costs versus the reported ones. I knew exactly where they were. In his private safe, in the hotel's bridal suite. The plan was a suicide mission. But it was the only way. The bridal suite at the Grand Regency was a fortress, but the day of a wedding is a day of chaos. There would be florists, caterers, photographers, and makeup artists streaming in and out. I knew Dylan's security team would be looking for a disgruntled former employee trying to sneak into the gala, but they wouldn't be looking for a woman who appeared to have finally broken. I needed to play the part of the disgrace one last time. I arrived at the hotel early the next morning. I wore a simple, dark dress and kept my head down, making myself look small and defeated. I loitered near the service entrance, watching the rhythms of the staff. I saw a group of florists struggling with a massive arch of roses and stepped forward to hold the door. They thanked me, assuming I was just another assistant. I slipped inside, the scent of 1,000 roses filling my lungs. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my mind was clear. I wasn't just Isla Thorne anymore. I was a ghost coming back to claim what was stolen. Getting to the bridal suite was the hardest part. I had to avoid the main elevators, where the cameras were thickest. I used the service stairs, climbing 12 flights until my legs burned. When I reached the floor, I saw Dylan's head of security standing near the suite door. I didn't hide. Instead, I walked right up to him, making sure my eyes looked red and watery. I told him I had a letter for Raymond, a parting gift from my father's old files that I wanted him to have before he got married. The guard hesitated. He knew I had been fired, but he also knew the long history between our families. He didn't want to be the one to cause a scene on Raymond's big day. 5 minutes, he grumbled, opening the door, and stay in the sitting room. The suite was empty. The bridal party was downstairs for photos. I didn't go to the sitting room. As soon as the door clicked shut, I bolted for the master bedroom. I knew the safe was behind a faux mahogany panel near the desk. My father had once joked that Dylan was too predictable to ever change his security codes. I tried his birthday. It failed. I tried the date of the mine collapse. The lock clicked open. Inside the safe, I found the ledgers. They were even more incriminating than I had imagined, showing a clear trail of money being laundered into offshore accounts to hide the safety cuts. But as I grabbed the books, my hand brushed against a thick, yellowed envelope. It was addressed to me in my father's unmistakable, blocky handwriting. My breath hitched. I opened it and felt the world tilt on its axis. It wasn't just a letter. It was a final confession. My father had known the collapse was coming. He had tried to trigger the manual emergency gates to get everyone out. But the letter explained that Dylan had intercepted him. Dylan hadn't just let the mine collapse. He had locked the emergency gate from the outside to ensure no one could get out and report his criminal negligence. He had murdered my parents and 32 other people just to make sure he wouldn't get caught. I stood in that silent, luxurious room, clutching the letter to my chest. The grief I had carried for 20 years transformed into something sharper, something final. This wasn't just a corporate takedown anymore. This was a reckoning for 34 lives. I was so lost in the letter that I didn't hear the door open. I turned around to find Raymond standing there, dressed in his tuxedo, looking like the perfect groom. His face went pale when he saw me holding the ledgers and the letter. "Isla? What are you doing?" "My father said you had a breakdown," he whispered, his voice trembling. He looked at the open safe and then at my face. I didn't try to hide the evidence. I held the letter out to him, my hands steady now. "I'm not the one having a breakdown, Raymond," I said softly. "But your father is about to." He took the letter, his eyes scanning the pages. I watched the color drain from his cheeks as he realized the man he idolized was a cold-blooded killer. "Tell me this isn't real," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Tell me he didn't do this." I didn't say a word. I just pointed to the gate lock order in the ledger, signed with Dylan's distinctive flourish. I had to choose right then. Spare my friend or finish the mission. I chose the truth. Raymond sat on the edge of the bed, the heavy silence of the room pressing down on us. For a long moment, I thought he was going to call security. I thought he was going to protect his family's name. But then he looked up, and I saw a fire in his eyes that I had never seen before. "He used me," Raymond whispered. "He used my wedding as a shield for his crimes. He used Beatrice." He stood up, handing the letter back to me. "What do we do? How do we stop him?" I told him the plan. I needed him to get me onto the stage during the reception. I needed him to ensure the technical crew didn't cut the power when I started talking. Raymond nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. I'll handle the AV team, he said. They work for me today, not him. But Isla, once this starts, there's no going back. He'll lose everything. I looked at him, seeing the pain he was burying for the sake of justice. He lost his soul a long time ago, Raymond. We're just letting the rest of the world know. The reception gala was a sea of white roses, expensive champagne, and the city's most powerful people. The air was thick with the smell of perfume and the sound of a string quartet. Dylan Rhymes stood at the center of it all, the king of his own manufactured universe. He was beaming, shaking hands, and soaking in the adoration. He looked toward the stage, where a massive digital display showed a beautiful 3D model of the halo, glowing like a beacon of progress. He had no idea that the Trojan horse was already inside his gates. I stood behind the heavy velvet curtains of the stage, my heart racing. Raymond was at the soundboard, giving me a subtle nod. The press cameras were lined up, their lenses focused on the podium. This was the moment. Dylan walked up to the microphone, the room falling silent in anticipation. Today is a day of new beginnings, he began, his voice booming with confidence. A day where we build upward, toward a future as bright as this young couple. I took a deep breath, clutching the drive in my hand. It was time to show him the true cost of his foundations. Just as Dylan began to describe the unmatched safety of the halo, the digital display behind him flickered. The beautiful 3D model vanished, replaced by a grainy black and white photograph. The room gasped. It was a photo of the Blackwood Mine rescue crews, their faces covered in soot and despair. Dylan froze, his smile faltering. He turned around, looking at the screen in confusion. There seems to be a technical glitch, he said into the microphone, his voice slightly higher than before. One moment, please. But the glitch didn't stop. The photo changed to a list of names, the 34 people who had died that night. My parents' names were at the very top in bold letters. The string quartet stopped playing. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the ballroom. I stepped out from behind the curtain, walking slowly toward the podium. Dylan's eyes widened when he saw me. He tried to move toward me, but Raymond stepped into his path, blocking him with a firm hand on his shoulder. The cameras were all rolling, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. The audio system hissed, and then a recording began to play. It was a file I had recovered from an old office system, a private conversation Dylan had with his foreman weeks after the collapse. The earth took out the trash, didn't it? Dylan's voice echoed through the ballroom, cold and mocking. 34 pensions I don't have to pay. That's the best return on investment I've had all year. The guests recoiled as if they had been struck. The sound of Dylan's laughter filled the space, sounding like the cracking of stone. Dylan's face turned a deep, mottled red. He grabbed the edges of the podium, his knuckles white. This is a fabrication, an AI-generated lie from a disgruntled employee, he screamed into the microphone, but his voice was shaking. I reached the podium and calmly placed my tablet on the glass surface. I looked directly into the lenses of the cameras, my voice clear and steady. It's not a lie, Dylan. It's a confession, and it's just the beginning. I swiped the screen, and the ledgers appeared for everyone to see. The clear trail of blood money. The federal structural engineers are already in the lobby, Dylan, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. And I sent the real soil reports to the global insurance underwriters an hour ago. They just pulled your bond. The halo is dead. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters started shouting questions, and the guests began to back away from Dylan, as if he were contagious. The man who had spent 20 years building a fortress of lies was suddenly standing in the middle of a ruins of his own making. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but he found none. Even his most loyal business partners were looking at their phones, seeing the news of his plummeting stock prices. You're bankrupt, Julian, I said, using his first name with a coldness that matched his own. Finished. He lunged for the tablet, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't look like a billionaire anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. But before he could reach it, the heavy doors of the ballroom swung open, The police and federal agents marched in, their uniforms a sharp contrast to the tuxedos and gowns. But Dylan didn't back down. He suddenly stopped and started laughing, a dry, hacking sound. He pulled a crumpled document from his inner pocket. "You think you're so smart, Isla? I knew you'd try something like this. I've been waiting for you to break." He held up the paper for the cameras. "This is a signed confession from your father, dated the day of the collapse. He admits to the safety violations. He admits it was his fault." My heart stopped. I looked at the signature on the bottom of the page. It looked exactly like my father's. The room went silent again. If this was true, my entire mission was a lie. The reporters began to murmur, the tide of public opinion shifting back toward the victim, Dylan Rhymes. He looked at me with a triumphant sneer. "He was a weak man, Isla, and he left you with nothing but his debts and his shame." I felt a wave of nausea. Could I have been wrong? Was my father the villain I had spent my life trying to defeat? Just as I felt the ground disappearing beneath my feet, Raymond stepped forward again. He wasn't looking at his father, he was looking at the big screen. "He's lying," Raymond said, his voice ringing out over the crowd. He wasn't holding a document, he was holding his phone, which was plugged into the AV system. "That confession is a forgery. My father had it made by a specialist in Switzerland 3 years ago. I found the emails on his private server this morning." He hit a button, and a series of emails appeared on the screen, detailing the creation of the fake document. But Raymond wasn't done. "And there's someone who wants to talk to the FBI." The screen flickered again, and a video call connected. An elderly man with a weathered face appeared, the retired foreman of the Blackwood Mine, a man everyone thought had died years ago. "Dylan Rhymes paid me $10 million to disappear to Switzerland and stay quiet about the gate," the man said, his voice raspy but firm. "But I can't die with this on my conscience. He locked those people in. I saw him do it." The ballroom was in a state of total shock. The foreman's testimony was the final nail in the coffin. But then the screen changed one last time, showing a complex financial map. "It's not just the insurance money," Raymond said, looking at his father with a mixture of pity and disgust. "He's been using the wedding fund, the company pension plans, and even my own inheritance to hide his losses from the failed projects. He didn't just kill Ila's parents. He's been stealing from everyone in this room for years." The IRS logo appeared at the bottom of the screen. "Every account associated with Rhymes Development has been frozen as of 5 minutes ago," the foreman added. The guests, many of whom had invested millions with Dylan, turned on him with a ferocity that was terrifying to watch. The man who had built his life on the concept of unforeseeable accidents was now facing a very predictable consequence. He had tried to use his son as a shield, but his son had become the sword that finally cut through his lies. Dylan lost his mind. He screamed, a guttural primal sound, and lunged at me, his fingers clawing for my throat. "I built this world. You're nothing but the daughter of a ghost," he shrieked. But as he lunged, he tripped over the long cord of the microphone. He crashed into the massive ice sculpture of the halo that sat on the buffet table. The 3-foot-tall, glass-like structure shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, showering him in frozen shards. He lay there on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his ego, while the FBI moved in to zip-tie his hands. As the agents pulled him up, I stepped closer to him. The room was buzzing with the sound of 100 conversations, but for a moment, it felt like it was just the two of us. He was bleeding from a small cut on his forehead, his expensive tuxedo ruined by the melting ice. He looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. He still didn't understand. He still thought he was the hero of his own story. But the world was finally seeing him for exactly what he was. A small, greedy man who had traded lives for steel. "I didn't just find the ledgers, Dylan," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the din. "I found the original deed to the Blackwood land in my father's safe. He didn't just work the mine, he bought the land the morning he died. He was going to turn it into a nature preserve. You've been trespassing on my family's property for 20 years. Every cent of profit you made from that land belongs to his estate. I'm not just taking your reputation, I'm taking every single penny you ever touched." Dylan's eyes went wide, and he let out a choked, desperate sound. The agents dragged him away, his heels scraping against the marble floor. The untouchable man was gone, replaced by a prisoner heading for a life behind bars. I stood there, watching him go, and for the first time in 20 years, the weight in my chest started to lift. The air in the ballroom felt cleaner, as if the shattering of the ice had cleared the stagnant atmosphere of his lies. I looked at the broken shards on the floor and saw my own reflection. No longer a victim, but a victor. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The news of Dylan's arrest and the wedding day reckoning topped every headline in the country. We saw montages of his name being stripped from buildings and the Halo project being dismantled before a single floor could be poured. Raymond and Beatrice handled the fallout with a grace I didn't think possible. Raymond used his remaining influence to help the authorities untangle the web of corruption, ensuring that the families of the mine victims finally received the settlements they had been denied for decades. Dylan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His lawyers tried to argue for a reduced sentence due to his age, but the judge, a woman whose own grandfather had worked in the mines, was unmoved. The Blackwood Butcher, as the tabloids called him, was destined to die in a cell no larger than the elevator in his former penthouse. He was penniless, alone, and forgotten by the city that had once worshipped him. The restoration had begun, and the truth was finally the foundation upon which we were building our lives. I didn't keep the millions for myself. I used the recovered estate funds to build the Thorne Memorial Park on the very site where the Blackwood Mine had once stood. We cleared the debris and planted thousands of trees, turning the Valley of Death into a sanctuary of life. At the center of the park, I built a state-of-the-art safety training center for young engineers. I wanted to make sure that the next generation would never have to choose between their jobs and their integrity. I became the CEO of a firm dedicated to foundations that never break. Every year on the anniversary of the collapse, I host a memorial service for the 34 families. We sit in the sunlight, surrounded by the rustling of leaves, and remember the people we lost. Raymond and Beatrice often come, bringing their young son, whom they named after my father. Seeing that little boy run through the grass, free from the shadow of his grandfather's crimes, is the greatest emotional payoff of my life. We aren't just survivors anymore. We are the architects of a better world, one built on the solid ground of justice and accountability. Today is the 20th anniversary of the night my world turned black. I am standing on the green grass of the park, looking out over the valley. The air is cool and smells of pine and fresh earth. I raise a glass of clear, cold water, not wine, to the sky. Foundations don't lie, Dad, I whisper, my voice carried by the wind. And neither does the truth. I think about the little girl who waited in the car, watching the dust rise, and I wish I could tell her that it was all going to be okay. I turn around and see my team of engineers walking toward me, their faces bright with purpose. We have a new project starting tomorrow, a low-income housing complex that will be the safest, most durable building in the city. My life is no longer defined by what was taken from me, but by what I am building for others. They called it revenge, but as I walk toward the future, I know the real word for it. I called it restoration. The truth didn't just break Dylan Rhymes, it set me free to finally live. If you were in Isla's shoes, could you have stayed silent for 20 years to play the long game, or would you have snapped sooner? Drop a sad in the comments if you think Dylan got exactly what he deserved. The truth always has a way of coming to the surface. If you live for stories where the underdog finally takes the crown and the villains lose it all, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't miss our next deep dive into betrayal, revenge, and the ultimate restoration.